Hi all, we're going to look at Game 7 of the World Championship match. Anand kicked off with d4, Kramnik played d5, and we saw another Slav variation, so a very solid defensive setup by black. After knight f3, knight f6, we saw knight c3, and now black took the pawn on c4. So this is one of the main variations. One of the ideas in this line is often black gets control of the b4 square for a bishop later, because white, in playing a4, is now weakening that b4 square. Black plays now bishop f5, and there's some central control of the e4 square. After e3, e6, white regains the pawn, and after bishop b4, black's exerting more pressure on that e4 square. So white castles, and now knight d7. Black's position is very solid and respectable, but maybe, some would argue it's not as interesting as, say, the King's Indian defence, but as a way of not losing and playing very solidly, this is a great system. Queen e2 now was played, and white prepares actually the possibility of e4 as a pawn sacrifice because of a tactic which I'm about to show you. After bishop g6, now e4. So why can't black win the pawn on e4? Well, let's have a look. Bishop takes c3, bc, and now knight takes e4 would be an attempt to win it, but there's bishop a3, and this is stopping the black king from castling kingside. And if black wanted to go for more material, then queen b2 here, so that's hitting the knight and the b7 pawn. So say knight d5, queen takes b7, and black's getting really badly done in here. So basically this is a bit of a poisoned pawn, which Kramnik decides just to safely castle instead. And it doesn't matter actually that white's potentially getting in e5, because black's got that light squared bishop on g6, and his king's very solid as a result. So bishop d3 now is played, and after bishop h5, this is quite an annoying pin, and it's difficult to see what active plan white has without compromising his position too much. White did play e5, which seems to be quite aggressive, but again with that bishop always ready to come to g6, there isn't too much of a white attack going on here. Actually here Anand he took on d5, so he's giving black control of e4 with a pawn after c takes d5, but now queen e3 was played. Now let's have a look at this position. This knight's a bit trapped in, it hasn't got too many useful squares because of this pawn chain. So are the black pieces okay? The bishop can come back to e7 if it wants, and this bishop can neutralise white's bishop. So it looks as though, although white's got this advantage in space, because of black's king being so solid, I think it's roughly equal here. In fact, Ribka gives 0.04, so it thinks it's almost dead equal. Black played actually here rook e8. And now maybe, there was an opportunity for something aggressive here. What was played in the game now at move 15 was knight e1, but this knight g5 is prompted by Ribka, so what's the matter with that? Knight g5 attacking the h7 pawn, and if knight f8, now here, is there anything good for white going on? Maybe queen h3, but if we see bishop g6, bishop takes g6, hg, how does white proceed here? It still seems to be rock solid for black, and if white tries too hard to win, he'll end up losing. So this knight g5, it seems an interesting alternative, but how does white progress from here? So let's go back. In fact, the knight it retreated to e1. So basically Anand's got other ideas, that he's anticipating that these bishops will come off, and he'll want to reroute the knight to the d3 square, or at least get a grip on these squares, particularly b4, c5 and e5. So after bishop g6 he took on g6 and now played knight d3. So the knight's more positionally placed than if it is at g5 doing nothing. And after queen b6, it seems Kramnik doesn't care about losing that dark squared bishop. So perhaps he could have considered retreating it to e7 to keep more tension in the position maybe. But maybe here, white plays bishop d2 and possibly b4, but has to worry about knight b6 to c4. So I don't know. This seems okay as well, bishop e7, but Kramnik decides he doesn't mind white taking on b4. So white did take on b4. And so we have a bishop and knight situation, bishop versus knight. So is this bishop bad or good? although there are pawns on dark squares, the bishop has a potential diagonal, this diagonal, which Anand now utilises. He plays b3, so he's temporarily weakening a little bit more the c3 square, which seems dangerous because, you know, black's got rook c8. But it's not enough to be an exploitable weakness, because after bishop a3, queen c3, Anand doesn't really have to take queens to increase black's rook pressure and penetration possibilities. He just actually plays rook ac1, doesn't mind the double pawns here. Again, you know, they're not really an exploitable weakness, these double pawns. So the position here is still roughly balanced. Black now plays f6, so he doesn't mind trying to undouble white's pawns if he can get some other interesting play going, but there isn't, because after bishop d6, white's just reinforcing the e5 pawn. And now g5 was played, so black potentially is preparing maybe to bring the king out in some lines, or maybe even king f7 and rook h8, but there's nothing really going on here. After h3, king f7, rook h8 is no big deal, that possibility, or king g6. After king f2, white's also centralising the king a little bit in symmetry to the black king. After king g6, now king e2. So the white king might be heading to d2 here, just to play rook takes c8 and rook c1. After f takes e, d takes e, black now played b6. So it seems, you know, Anand's pawn structure isn't ideal, and black might have the possibility of knight c5 to e4. But on the other hand, after knight c5, white could always take that knight. But here he actually decides to stop knight c5 altogether by playing the move b4. So one question which springs to my mind is, you know, can black undermine control of c5 by playing a5? Let's have a quick look if a5 had been played, b5, and now let's say knight c5. Well, here bishop takes, pawn takes, king d3. And apparently, you know, Rybka likes white's position, so there's an advantage here. Maybe it's based on the idea of rook f3 potentially. So rook h8, rook f3, for example. This would be okay for white. If c4 ever, then king d4. So let's go back to the game. After b4 was played, actually rook c4 was played, and it seems, you know, black's potentially got this passed pawn, but which can also be potentially munched if, you know, e4, king e3, king d4. But Kramnik had seen he can get a drawing type fortress, because even if the pawn is dropped off, white has no entry points now into the black position. So if king d3 here to try and win the pawn, for example, then it doesn't matter if that pawn drops off. In this kind of position, there's no entry points for white. So even though a pawn up, it's kind of academic. So after this, rook c2 was played instead of king d3. And after king f7, now king d3. Knight check, and the minor pieces came off. Rook takes c3, and so we see this endgame again, where although white's a pawn up, it's a dead fortress for both sides. They can't get into each other's position. It wouldn't matter if white had extra pawns, even on e2, e4, a2, a3. It's just no entry points, and so white's material advantage is just academic. Let's have a quick overview and summary of this game. So there's a very solid Slav variation, and Kramnik resisted the temptation to try and win a pawn with bishop takes c3. He doesn't want to be slaughtered again. So he plays exceptionally solidly, he just plays castles. And after bishop d3, bishop h5, now white gets this seemingly aggressive wedge pawn in the centre. But after knight d5, white took, and we see the knight actually retreating to go to d3 now, and more minor pieces were exchanged off. And then we saw the queens come off, with white having seemingly a slightly compromised pawn structure with double pawns, but the king's centralisation guaranteed that white is not any worse. And now we saw an absence of entry points, even if white won the pawn, which he did in the game, and then a draw was agreed. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.